See, what happens is when we step into our kingdom authority and exercise God's power through obedience, we're drawn into an amazing connection to the King of the universe. And here's what begins to happen. We begin to create the future.
Hey, friends and neighbors, welcome back for the 64th time to the Daron Earlewine podcast. That's right, episode 64. Stoked to be back with you. I want to thank you so much for downloading the episode. And I say that every week, and I was actually reflecting upon saying that every week as I was listening to another podcast by someone else, and they said the same thing. And it made me just, I could tell how genuinely, I felt like at least, that they were grateful that I had downloaded their podcast, and it made me feel like I wanted to make sure I started this episode by just reiterating how much we really do appreciate you downloading the episode. And the reason is we don't do this podcast week in and week out just because we have nothing else to do here in the wonderful city of Indianapolis, Indiana. It's because we really believe in this content. We believe in the conversations we have, and we believe in you. And we believe in what God has created you to do. And so the opportunity to spend this time with you doing whatever you're doing as you're listening or you're watching the podcast and applying what I teach you, applying what God teaches you, and just the stories we get to hear from you as far as what it looks like for you stepping into who God's created you to be. It means it's so fulfilling to us as a team. And so thank you for taking the time to do so. If you would, we would love it if you'd leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening on or watching on, and maybe share the episode with 3 or 4 friends that you go, you know what, I think this episode would inspire them. And it means a lot to us. So we're jumping in, episode 64. We're walking through Spiritual DNA 2.0 in these series of episodes. We started last week. And we took some time to talk about the concept of kind of why I started Spiritual DNA, the heart behind it. And we looked at these 2 concepts of pardon and participation and how important they are for us as human beings, that we need pardoned, right? We need a pardon. And what that does is it steps us into what God calls a covenant relationship. And then there's a longing in our souls to participate. We want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We have a sense in our soul. We wake up in the morning, we feel it. We go to bed at night, we sense it, that we're supposed to join together to do something, to participate in something that creates. And that's a part of being in God's kingdom. I'm going to share about that a little bit deeper in this episode. But that's where we were last week. And one of the illustrations I love to give, I actually give it in Spiritual DNA 2.0 in the videos, and I use it a lot when I speak, whether it be at companies or churches, and is the idea that sometimes we have to ask questions about our questions, and this idea of us feeling like we should do something significant. I always draw people's attention back to their pets, right? I always ask people, hey, do you have any pets, any dogs, cats? And, it's always a great moment for a joke, right? I always ask if anybody owns birds or snakes, and then we point and laugh at those people. Just kidding. We shouldn't laugh at bird owners, although sometimes when the shoe fits or the bird flaps, we've got to make fun of them. I don't know why you own birds. I really don't know why you own snakes, because if you own snakes, they can eat your birds. That's a whole situation we don't want to be involved in. Although my wife, this is random. This is just a bonus. Can we just push pause on the podcast and just you and me talk for a minute? My wife is a developmental therapist, and she goes to people's homes and she works with kids that are 0 to 3 years old that have developmental delays. Great job. She loves it. She's really good at it. But she goes into people's homes, and God knows what you're going to see when you go to people's homes. She had a client a couple years back, had lots of animals, birds specifically, cats, birds. They were everywhere. Well, one day she comes in to do therapy with the kid, and they have a bird. I want to say it's a parrot, could be a parakeet, parakeet. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It was a large bird. Wings were clipped, right? Because you got to keep the bird in the house. So when it's down walking around the house, it's unable to escape any threat because it cannot fly away. My wife sits down to do the therapy, and I want to say it's a parrot. For the story, it's a parrot. The parrot is around my wife. She freaks out. She doesn't like birds. Out of nowhere, their big dog runs into the room, grabs the parrot by the neck, snaps its neck. Parrot dies right there. I mean, I can't make this stuff up. If you're watching right now, listening, and you're a parrot fan, I'm sorry if I've triggered you into a moment of sorrow, but can you imagine being in the house and the dog kills the parrot? Listen, we shouldn't have animals that want to kill things. Let's just say that, okay? But think about your animal, not the dead ones, just the alive ones. And here's the deal. We have a dog named Theo, and never have I ever, in 7 years of Theo's life, ever noticed that he seemed depressed, like he felt like he wasn't living his dog life best. He just sits around the house. He gets excited to eat in the morning, eat in the afternoon. Sometimes he goes on walks. That's all he does, and he's just happy as a dog could be. And the question I want you to deal with, and like I said, I say this all the time when I'm speaking, and it's in the DNA material, is you have to ask yourself a question is, why do I feel like I should actually be a part of something significant? Why do I feel like my life should matter? Because Theo doesn't, your dog doesn't, and that dead parrot didn't, okay? And the reason is because those animals were not created in the image of God, and you were. You were created in the image of God to be actually a part of his creation, a part that brought leadership and significance and partnership with God to create the future that's on God's heart and God's mind. We've talked about that before in the podcast, but I want to continue to reiterate it because I don't want you being confused about where these desires and where this push or this need for significance come from. It comes from the fact that you were created on purpose by God, right? On purpose and for purpose. It's right here on the coffee mug, to join him in what he's doing. And that's to live in his kingdom as a part of his family. And the two terms we brought last week were covenant and kingdom. And within the spiritual DNA material, I teach these concepts using triangles. And I've taught this a little bit on the podcast in past episodes. If you've not seen it, you don't have to go back and find it. But what I want to do is I want you to see and hear a little bit of the material from Spiritual DNA 2.0 right now. I want to pull a clip in as I'm teaching covenant and kingdom triangle. I want you to listen to and I want you to watch this clip. Give you a little bit of a teaser of what kind of stuff is in Spiritual DNA 2.0, but it'll also help you get this understanding because what I want to do, I want you to see this understanding of covenant and kingdom, and then we come back, the rest of this episode, I want to talk to you about the importance of activation or awakening of your spiritual DNA so that you can live into this reality. Let's jump into this clip right now where I teach about covenant kingdom from Spiritual DNA 2.0.
Okay, before we jump into all of our assessments, I think it'd be a good idea for us to kind of establish the kind of relationship and what we're really dealing with and kind of the environment that we live out our spiritual DNA. And it comes down to two structures. What I want to walk you through today is a covenant relationship and a kingdom authority or responsibility, if you will. And I'm very indebted to Mike Breen from 3DM Ministries. He taught me this many years ago, and it was transformational for me. And so I want to start off by us understanding that. So when we come into a relationship with God, which you may have just done in the last video, you're entering a covenant relationship. Now, this is unique, and it's important for us to understand how this works. It's not just like a friendship. It's not just your buddy, Jesus, okay? Being invited into a covenant is huge. The word covenant literally means becoming one. And so as we're entering into a relationship with God, he's saying, listen, I want to actually become one with you. He's not separate. He's not keeping you at arm's length. He's saying, as we read already, right, that you're going to participate in the divine nature. Okay, so you're becoming one with God. You would understand this if you're married or you have been, right? When you enter a covenant, the covenant of marriage, okay, you exchange names and you become one with the other person. The other grounds of a covenant, which are really, really interesting, is covenant making was very common in the ancient times and in the Old Testament where you had nomadic tribes. What happened is if you were traveling through another person's land, you would engage in a covenant relationship with them. And what it would do, it is ensure if you were the weaker or smaller tribe, that the stronger, more powerful tribe would say, I will covenant with you that while you are in my territory, I promise on my life to protect and provide for your tribe. Now, you see in the Old Testament that God created a covenant with Abraham. And so God was saying, you are now my people. We are becoming one. In fact, they exchanged names. Abraham got a couple of H's from God's name, Yahweh, right? And they became one. And God said, I will promise to protect and provide for you, the Israelite people, right? All the way through on my life. The interesting thing that sets us up for the covenant that we're invited into is the old covenant was great, but ours is actually, the Bible tells us, is superior because our covenant, it actually extends forever. into the next life. And as Jesus gave his life for us, he invites us into a new covenant. If you maybe have been to church before, you've ever taken communion, that's one thing we celebrate. They're the body and the blood of Christ. And what's interesting is in covenant making, even in the Old Testament times, is oftentimes there was a sacrifice of an animal for the covenant, and then they shared a meal of bread and wine. So we do that same thing with our covenant with Jesus. And so what God is saying to us is, I'm inviting you into a relationship that will be for eternity. And that the promise here is that I will protect and provide for you as we become one. That's important to know what we're getting into. Now, here's how this is structured to work, is that we get in a relationship, the Father, right? He woos us to himself through the grace and the mercy of Jesus. And by grace and through Jesus, we are given a new identity. This is declared over us. This is about who we are. We're going to unpack this here in greater capacity in the next session about the Enneagram. But the first thing that God established is our identity. He tells us who we are. The Bible says things like that we become the righteousness of Christ. We become the children of God. It talks about that we are now the salt and light of the earth. There's a passage that talks about we're now the ambassadors of God as if he was making his appeal through us. We're told that we're the workmanship of God through Christ Jesus, that we're created in advance, that we're created in him to do good works, which he's prepared in advance for us to do. All of that is our biblical protein promises like we just talked about. And they form our identity. Out of our identity, then, we step out into obedience. As we grow in greater obedience, right, we're driven up into greater connection and intimacy with God. This is how a covenant relationship is designed by God to work. DNA, we're learning about DNA probably about right here, right? Learning about who you are. And from this, you will become what you already are. As we just said, right, you've already been given everything you need. Your DNA is a part of the identity that God's given you. And so it's interesting, my friend Dave Mullins used to say that it's this process of that we are, but not yet. Physically, you get that, right? When you were conceived, you are, right? You were you, but not yet. And you've matured into becoming who you are. This is so true about you. Your identity is set because of who God says you are. You work your obedience out of that and draws you up into a greater connection. Here's how you and I usually run it, though. Here's how we do it. We've got connected to God somehow, and then we become absolutely obsessed with obedience. Rights, wrongs, do's, don'ts, rules. We become obsessed with what? God is obsessed with who? We become obsessed with what? And here's, if you're like me at all, and I've been around a lot of people, is what happens is you look at your obedience and it's usually not that great sometimes, right? That's why we need the grace. And what happens is every 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 days, I don't know how often you grade yourself spiritually. What happens is you then tell yourself who you are. And oftentimes we even like to grab scriptures and take them out of context and say things like, well, you know me, what I'm doing right here, not that great, but hey, just a sinner saved by grace. Sinner saved by grace. Which was true about you. You were a sinner. You were saved by grace. Then you became a child of God. Your identity changed. And until we actually believe that God has given us a new identity, that the old has come, right? The old is gone, the new has come. Here's what will happen. We'll tell ourselves who we are. Usually we give ourselves about a C- in Christianity, right? And so we think probably, God probably doesn't actually want to be in a relationship with us because we're such a loser Christian. Or maybe we've been doing so great. We've been, volunteering with junior high kids and helping, old ladies across the street or something. We're like, I'm really killing the Christian game right now. So I don't even really need God because I'm doing so good at following all the rules. One of those is at work in your life. But we got to make sure that we live this and walk this the correct way. The identity actually flows out of obedience. Now, here's the cool thing. We're stepping into a covenant relationship about who we are. We're going to unpack that a little more in the Enneagram. The neat thing about this relationship with God is that one of the reasons that I didn't trust God and I didn't know if I wanted to really get into the whole Jesus thing was the idea of significance that we talked about, right? That we want to accomplish, we want to make an impact, we want to have an influential life. God gave us that. That's not rebellion in your spirit. That's actually God's spirit coming out and saying, I created you to lead and to be significant, to have an impact on this world. Because here's the crazy thing, our Father is the King of the universe. We're invited into a covenant relationship to represent a kingdom. The kingdom of God, of light, of faith and hope and love. And so it's not just I have a relationship with God, it's I have a relationship with God, a new identity, so that when I go out of my life, I actually exercise the authority that God has given me, right? Jesus said to his disciples, therefore all authority has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of the whole world, right? And here's the deal, I'll be with you as you do that the whole time. He's near us, not far from us. He's for us, not against us. So you have been given an identity and you have the authority to represent God on earth. That's big, isn't it? I'd say for me, if you talk about identity, is if I really believed that my father was the king of the universe, I think I'd walk into the room a little bit different. How about you? I'm guessing if your dad's a CEO or your dad's like the president of the United States or the king of some country, like when you show up, it's not like, hey, I'm here, right? Excuse me, right? Like, I'll just be in the background, right? Like, no, like you walk in with, there's an identity that has brought an authority that I am here to represent the king. How would Monday mornings look for you if the story you began telling about yourself, which is true about you, by the way, is that I'm showing up with the identity, the authority of the actual king of the universe to actually be here to represent him for faith and hope and love? I think it might change your job from something mundane to possibly something extraordinary. So what happens is we give the authority of God, we step out and we actually exercise that through power, and that power brings us up into greater worship of God. Check it out. We do this backwards as well, okay? Here's what usually happens in our life. We're not sure we see much power in our life. It's like I go to work on Mondays, I get to the weekend, I go to church, I like a couple of the songs they sing, or I don't even go to church because it's boring, or whatever your story is. Like, I don't know that God's power is at work. I haven't healed anybody this week, right? And what happens is when we're not sure we see God's power in our life, here's what we begin to assume. We assume it's probably because we don't have his authority. This is why when my life as a pastor, sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say things like, well, I can't pray for people. I can't lead a Bible study. I couldn't start that company. I can't fill in the blank. I don't have the authority to do whatever actually my soul is calling out from within me to do. I'm just me. I don't think I have the authority. And here's what happens. As we lay in dormancy and we don't step into our kingdom calling, it also cuts us off from connecting to God. And here's one of the really dangerous things. We actually begin to question if God really is the king of the universe. Like, is this all true? Maybe it's just a figment of my imagination. See, what happens is when we step into our kingdom authority and exercise God's power through obedience, we're drawn into an amazing connection to the king of the universe. And here's what begins to happen. We begin to create the future. My emails are always signed, creating the future. And I sometimes want to take it off because I'm like, is that kind of pompous? Is that a little too much? But I don't necessarily sign my emails that way for you. I sign my emails that way for me, to remind myself what is true about me and true about you. I'm in a covenant relationship with the God of the universe. He has given me a new identity. He has given me a spiritual DNA that has equipped me perfectly to step into the calling that he has placed me on earth to do. And as I join with him and step into faith into that identity and exercise it through obedience, what happens is the authority of God and the power of God work through my life, and I join him in creating the future.
And we're back. I got to use it again. We haven't had the interviews. I haven't got to use the dream chimes. I'm so happy right now. I feel like we're back into a good momentum. I know you guys have been missing the dream chimes. Well, they're back in episode 60, whatever I said this was, 4. So now you understand the concept of covenant kingdom. This is so foundational for us to understand, because I want to make sure that you and I stay out of that performance trap that I talked about and truly step into the peace that a covenant relationship brings. That we don't have anything to prove to God. We don't have anything to please, right? We have nothing to protect. We're always and completely loved in this covenant, and then invited by grace to walk with and participate in what God's doing. And that's when I talk about all the time, one of the key phrases we say here again and again on the podcast, right, is that when you know your worth, you'll change your world. And that worth is not something that you stir up by your degrees. It's not something you stir up by your grades. It's not something you stir up by your personal style. It's not something you stir up by your social media influence. This isn't your worth by your bottom line. This isn't about your portfolio. This is about understanding the worth that you possess as an image bearer of God that has been created in his image on purpose and for a purpose, and that God saw so much worth in you that Jesus came to actually die to remove any barrier that you would have from a relationship with God, from that covenant relationship. That's how much worth your life possesses, that God would give his life that you might find life with him. And you can't miss that, because when you begin to understand the worth of that, of the love that you have received, it changes your perspective on yourself and on the world. And when that happens, you begin to change your world. Now, the other side of this worth is about the gifts and abilities that are contained within your spiritual DNA. We've talked about that time and time again, right? Here's from the Passage translation coming. I'm going to give you the passage, the core passage from spiritual DNA. I'm going to kind of try to keep reading this as much as I can until you guys get it memorized in like 3 or 4 different translations of the Bible, because it makes a difference. Here it is again, 2 Peter 1, 3 through, I'm going to go through basically 3 through 4 here. Everything we could ever need for life and godliness has already been deposited in us by his divine power. We talked about that last week. If you haven't listened, go back and listen, but you already have it, okay? Everything you've needed for life and godliness has already been deposited in you within your spiritual DNA. You don't go to get a booster shot of DNA. It's in you. And here's what it says. For all this was lavished upon us through the rich experience of knowing him, Jesus, right? Who has called us by name, that's impressive, and invited us to come to him through a glorious manifestation of his goodness. As a result of this, he has given you magnificent promises that are beyond all price, so that through the power of these tremendous promises, we can experience partnership with the divine nature by which you have escaped the corrupt desires that are of the world. So much to unpack in this passage. But understanding the magnificent promises, understanding the power of these tremendous promises, understanding the experiencing the partnership with the divine nature, all of this is predicated and based on what it talks about in the first part of this passage. And it's what has to happen to actually activate or awaken, if you will, your spiritual DNA. Because right now in your flesh or in your human self, like as I talked about last week, if you've not been pardoned by God, you're kind of a half a human being. You have your physical body and abilities, but if your spirit has not been awakened, if this, what I just read for you, has not taken place yet, you're half a human being. You're trying to fulfill all of the needs and abilities and desires of your life in your physical self, and you were never created for that. You were created to be physical and spiritual, brought together for this partnership, right? This magnificent partnership with God. And so what I want to give you today is the basics of how you awaken or activate this connection with God so that you can have the full worth of who he's created you to be and experience the fullness that this passage unpacks. And if you've not done that yet, this is the best time you could ever do it, because I don't think it's a random coincidence that you're listening to this podcast now when you're going through what you're going through in your life, right? There's only 2 options in life. Everything in the world is a coincidence, or God's in control of everything, and he set everything up so it would be easy for you to find him and find who he's created you to be. That's just what he's done. And so for us to understand this, we have to look, it almost goes back into, and I love that Jesus gives us an example from everyday life again, for physical life, so we can get our minds around a spiritual reality. A lot of times it does help to bring it down into a physical understanding that we go, yeah, I get that. And so that's what Jesus does. And we get this from John chapter 3. And this may be old news for you. If it is, no problem. Maybe by hearing me teach it again, you'll learn it to greater capacity and it'll help you teach it to someone else, right? Because the good news of the gospel always comes to you on its way to someone else. But Jesus is talking to a man named Nicodemus, and Nicodemus has the same questions, the same desires, the same concerns, the same worries that you and I'd have. He's a teacher of the law. He's trying to do this religious thing. If you go back to the covenant triangle that you learned about, right, he's running it backwards. And he comes to Jesus under cover of night, and he says to Jesus, he says, Rabbi, we all know that you're a teacher straight from God. No one could do all the God-pointing, God-revealing acts you do if God weren't in on it. So he says, listen, I'm coming to the source. I got some questions about God. I got some questions about my spirit. I got some questions about how do I live this life the way that I'm supposed to. So I'm coming straight to the source here. And Jesus says, hey, you're absolutely right. Take it from me. Unless a person is born from above, it's not possible to see what I'm pointing to God's kingdom. How can anyone, said Nicodemus, be born who's already been born and grown up? You can't re-enter your mother's womb and be born again. What are you saying with this born from above talk? Now, this makes sense. If you've been around the church at all, you've probably heard people talk about people that are born again Christians. And I think there was even a point in my life where I was like, well, that's something we say at church, but it doesn't actually mean that happens. And that's basically what Nicodemus is saying. Like, what is this? Come on, Jesus, I can't be born again physically. So I'm not sure what you're talking about. That's confusing. Why don't you just give me some straight talk? And so Jesus says, you're not listening. Let me say it again. Unless a person submits to this original creation, the wind hovering over the water creation, the invisible moving the visible, a baptism into a new life, it's not possible to enter God's kingdom. When you look at a baby, it's just that, a body you can look at and touch. But the person who takes shape within is formed by something you can't see and touch, the Spirit, and becomes a living spirit. If Jesus is saying that in this process you become a living spirit, that's what I was saying to earlier, is that if you haven't come to this place, you don't have a living spirit. You have a dead spirit in you that needs to be brought to life, what Jesus just said there, right? And you can't re-enter your mother's womb, but you can be spiritually born again. And what Jesus is saying there is, unless a person submits to this original creation, the wind hovering over the water creation, it's not possible to enter God's kingdom. What he's pointing back to is Genesis, where when God created the heavens and the earth, he took the dust of the ground, right, and he formed Adam. And then it says he breathed his breath, his spirit, or the Hebrew word there, the Hebrew word is ruach. He breathed his breath into Adam, and he became a human being, flesh and spirit. That was the original creation. You were created to be a spiritual and physical being that lived for eternity in partnership with God, taking care of the world. That's what human beings are for. That's why you sense you're supposed to do something significant more than your dog, your bird, your cat, or your snake. But sin broke that connection, and we've been separated from God, and our spirits have died. And for us to become the person we're created to be, we have to be reborn and submit and be reestablished to this original creation, God's Spirit hovering over our lives and then bringing us to life, being reborn. That's the awakening that you have to experience if you're going to experience and live in the fullness of your spiritual DNA. And the way you do it is very simple. The work has already been done, which is the really good news. You say, Daron, what I have to do? I have to follow all the rules. Is that what happens? I have to start going to church all the time, and I got to listen to your podcast every week. Yes, you do. It's in the Bible. It's in the Song of Pop podcast, verse 12. And it says, for salvation, you have to listen to my podcast every week. It doesn't say that. There's not a lot of do's. We talked about that, right, in the covenant triangle, right, the kingdom triangle. This isn't a performance-based thing where you work hard, you try to keep all the rules, and there's God has this big scale, right? And if you do enough good and you outweigh the bad, then you get to live this life. There is no scale. It is finished, right? There is no actually counting of sins or because what Jesus did is when he came and he died once for all for the sins of all humanity. And so your debt has already been paid. The separation between you and God has already been removed. And the free gift of rebirth, the free gift of awakening, the free gift of activation of spiritual DNA, the free gift of salvation is a free gift that you need to receive. You need to tell Jesus very openly, very honestly, very humbly, very authentically, I want to live again. That's actually one of my favorite lines of any movie. And it comes from It's a Wonderful Life, the Christmas movie. My kids make fun of me every Christmas because I want to watch It's a Wonderful Life, but it's literally one of my favorite movies. And this year it made sense why It's a Wonderful Life was one of my favorite movies. It's because my whole life I was afraid I was going to be George Bailey from the movie. If you don't know the movie, he sacrifices all of his dreams just to take care of his hometown, and he gets stuck in Bedford Falls, and everybody else chases dreams, and here's George being the reliable guy back at home. And I realized that I resonated with that movie as a kid growing up because I had all these dreams, and I was afraid if I trusted God with the good stuff of my life that he was going to ruin my life, that I wasn't going to get to actually chase after this sense of significance and calling that was on my life. And what I began to do is I began to distrust God in the process. Now I've learned that those were lies I was chasing. But what I love in the movie is, if you know how it works out, is that George wishes he had never been born, and he gets a guardian angel named Clarence, and he kind of takes him through the whole thing. And when George begins to realize the wonderful life that God had given him to live, there's a moment at the end where he's crying and he's praying, and he says, God, I want to live again. Please let me live again. And God answers his prayer. In the end of the movie is an amazing celebration. And the same is true for you. That's all you got to do. You got to come to the place where you realize that you've been living half of a life, and you just tell God honestly, God, I want to live again. If you've invited me into this relationship and you've created me for great purpose and significance within your kingdom, bring me to life so I can experience that. And Jesus invites us. One of my other favorite passages, right? It's Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, where he says, listen, are you tired? You're worn out? You're burned out on religion? Come to me. There's the invitation. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I want to live again. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Hey, friend, if that's where you're at, let's do it right now. Let's have a moment of activation and awakening so you can live the life God created you to live. If that's where you're at, I want you to just pray with me. I want you to say, Jesus, I want to live again. Thank you for forgiving me of my sins. Thank you for your death. Thank you for your resurrection. Thank you for your love. Thank you for the worth and the value that you saw in me from the beginning of creation. I pray that you would teach me to walk with you and to learn from you. I pray that you would teach me to become who I was born to be. Jesus, I want to live again. Amen. Listen, friend, if you prayed that prayer, you were just born again. You've experienced spiritual awakening, and now your life begins. A life that has already given you everything you need to live and to become a you were born to be. And if you prayed that prayer with me right now, please, please, please reach out to me so I can help you take a next step. So we as a ministry can come around you and help you take this next step. Maybe get you connected to some online or some real community where you live. You can just reach out to me. Text me, 317-550-5070. Email me, Daron@blackbirdmission.com, or reach out through any of the socials. Just search my name on Facebook and on Instagram. I'm out there. I want to know that you've come to life because I want to help you live the life you were created to live. Deal? Deal. Whew. This is a fun one. I'm so proud of you. So grateful that you've trusted me to be on this journey. Can't wait to talk to you next week. We're just going to keep getting deeper and deeper into this understanding of spiritual DNA. And I can't wait to watch you walk into the life that God's created for you. God bless you guys. Until we talk next week, remember this: God's for you, not against you. He's near you, not far from you. And He's created you on purpose and for a purpose. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Daron Earlewine Podcast.